Greetings, YouTube. So I found myself thinking about full conversion cyborgs recently. I covered some of that in a recent video. And if you're in a full conversion cyborg, or if you're wired into the net, sort of like in the Matrix, or if you're running a golem, so you're remotely operating a robotic body of some variety, whether it be construction equipment or a one designed to look like a human, regardless, you get biofeedback, all haptic responses coming through. Particularly if you're in a human model, you could hear and feel and taste and smell. You get the entire panoply of senses, and possibly even ones that we don't have at the moment. Wider visual range and hearing in ranges that you can't now, or some things that like radar or sonar. If you're picking up all this sensory data, and particularly if you're using a cyborg body or remote robotic system, a golem, that has fully functional genitals and such, so you're able to engage in sex with other people, or if you're wired into a matrix where you're able to do that in a pure digital environment, so you're, the whole idea of Second Life, but taken, to cranked up to 11. Isn't that sort of like the best drug ever? And if you can stimulate the human pleasure centers when you have virtual sex or physical sex between two bots or two cyborgs, couldn't you just stimulate the human pleasure centers at will? Just push a little button and suddenly you feel really, really good. Niven touched on that in a number of his stories. I believe the junkies were called Troadheads or something like that, short of Electrodes, because they had their pleasure centers being stimulated directly, and they could do it anytime they wanted to. They very rapidly became addicted to this mechanism, and I can imagine why. There was one film, Natalie Wood was in it. It was her last film or close to the last film, which dealt with wiring people into memories, and eventually it led to someone having the experience of being wired into someone's head when they died, so they basically saw the afterlife kind of thing. But one of the people loops a tape of an orgasm and then just plays it. And then because he's now stuck in a loop of orgasms, he can't get out. And by the time he's found, he's been stuck in this tape loop, this recorded loop, for hours and hours. And it's just rewired his brain. So that even though after they extract him and now he's no longer connected to the memory, he keeps having orgasms at random. And he's no longer able to function, essentially. And if you could do that, why would you have an elaborate Matrix-like artificial universe from the movie The Matrix? So you've got a bunch of people in their little pods and using them as batteries, which doesn't work. The amount of energy required to keep a human being alive is more than the amount of energy you get out. That's physics, folks. But say you do this anyway for some twisted reason. Instead of creating an elaborate artificial world which some people can break out of, and then they can come out and break free physically, and then they hunt you down and try to destroy your world again and again and again, a la The Matrix. And I'm still looking forward to sequels to that movie. Why don't you just have the pleasure centers wired directly? And then when the person in the pod gets physically restless, you go boop for 5 or 10 seconds, and then they settle right back down. And they start getting fidgety again, you boop. And if you're a full conversion Borg, what's to stop you from just going boop whenever you want to? Now, admittedly, if you're a hireling of someone else, they've paid for your body and you work for them, there are, of course, going to be inhibitors that prevent that. But if you own the chassis, if it's yours, And street mechanics and docks can do anything you want. What's to prevent you from just blissing out until you die? Or wiring yourself into a machine that takes care of your body's needs, waste and food in and all that stuff. And then you just keep that thing on whatever for as long as you want. And wouldn't that be the most powerful drug in the universe? All it costs to run is a very tiny amount of electricity. The amount of energy required to stimulate the human pleasure center is probably going to be infinitesimal. Because let's face it, the amount of current that runs our entire body is pretty darn small. We are not putting out a lot of juice, contrary to what the Matrix will tell you. So, other than Niven, has anyone ever touched on that? Because I don't remember seeing that in any kind of cyberpunk story or role-playing game. I can remember touching on something like that in one of the Cyber Generation modules where essentially they had slaves, and as rewards, they would put them into machines that would stimulate their pleasure centers. And they were told they were being, stimulated for like an hour or 2 hours. In actuality, they were being stimulated for a couple of minutes. They'd bliss out, they'd pass out, and then they'd just put them in someplace to sleep it off. But in all the cyberpunk supplements I read, in all the games I read, in all the short stories and novels I read, and I read quite a few of these, no one really made that part of the world. And it seems like it would be really important. I mean, you could just become an addict in minutes. I mean, let's face it, human beings go to a lot of effort to achieve orgasm, to achieve that high through heroin or cocaine or what have you. And if you could just do it like that, that would be really tempting. Now, I've never done a psychoactive drug. Never done mushrooms or things like that. Never done LSD. But I've often thought if I could get myself pharmaceutical grade stuff and I had someone who was experienced and willing to help me through it, I'd try it. But the caveat is I'm not buying something off the street, and I have to make sure it was done under very carefully medically supervised conditions. But stimulating the human pleasure centers is really safe. There's no drug overdose risk. You just turn it on. And if you're already a full conversion cyborg or wired into the Matrix or wired into a golem, you already got the hardware. You already got the hardware built into you. You need that hardware to be able to operate the system that you're wired to. It just occurred to me that why hasn't this been a bigger thing in role-playing games and fiction or films? It seems to be like this gaping hole in the whole concept of being wired into the machine. And nobody ever seems to have really talked about it before. Now, I could just be in the dark here. There could be a plethora of fiction and settings and things that have touched on this. So if someone would like to tell me and point me into some wikis or something, I could look at it. That would be cool. But this seems like it should be a really big and important part of any cyberpunk campaign, whether it's cyberpunk or cyber generation or whatever derivative that you prefer. Interface Zero, I think, is another good example. Shoot. What was it a Tristat book out there? That had like 3 or 4 different settings in one hardcover. I can't remember what the name of the book is. I can't picture the cover in my head. Can't remember. Deus Ex, maybe? No, that's a video game. But regardless, I know there's lots of different cyberpunk sources out there. So if anybody knows of one that actually deals with this, whether it's a book or a film or a role-playing game, point me in the direction. I'd like to go look it up, at least, even if I don't want to consume the piece of media itself. But let's talk about this. Have you ever dealt with this in a campaign? Because I know I haven't. I feel like I've failed. Like, how did I not know this? How did I not pull this in? I should have. It's bleeding obvious when you think about it. So I dropped the ball on this one. I want to know if anybody else has picked it up and run with it. So tell me, what do you think about the simulation of the human pleasure centers when it comes to Cyberpunk?